Snow fell in soft, soundless sheets, as though the world itself wanted to hush. The forest wore a cold stillness, branches heavy with white, each flake catching the faint light of a pale moon. Through that unforgiving quiet moved a young woman, small, shivering, her breath rising in fragile clouds. Her long silver hair clung to her shoulders like silk frozen in place. Every step she took was uneven, every breath a struggle against the wind cutting through her thin dress. She pressed her arms against her chest to keep what little warmth she had left. Behind her lay the faint groove of wagon tracks, already being erased by snow. They had not even waited until morning to leave her. The storm pressed against her bones as she stumbled forward, barely knowing where she was headed. She had grown up hearing stories of these woods. People said the trees swallowed cries whole, that the wild was where cursed souls disappeared. Perhaps that was why they'd brought her here. Perhaps they believed the forest would finish what they didn't have the courage to do. The words they hurled at her still echoed: bad luck, omen, cursed girl. The weight of those whispers was colder than the snow beneath her bare feet. Once, long ago, she had tried to smile at the other girls in town. They had turned their faces away, clutching crosses at their throats. Once, she had tried to help her aunt mend a fence, but her aunt's hands shook as though touching her shadow would bring ruin. When she was a child, the children whispered behind their hands. When she grew older, the men averted their eyes. When her hair caught the sunlight, the townsfolk crossed themselves and spat. She had lived her entire life on the outskirts, watching the world belong to everyone else. Her name was Alma Rose. She was 22 years old, and she had never been wanted. Her breath came ragged now. The storm was worsening, wind howling like something alive. She stumbled near a creek, the surface a sheet of ice. Her knees hit the ground hard, snow burning her skin. She did not cry. She simply let her body fold in on itself, as though surrender was the only thing left to offer. For a moment she thought perhaps this was how it was always meant to end, silent, cold, unseen. She pressed her forehead to the ground and whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry." She wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. Maybe to herself. Maybe to the little girl she'd been before shame became her language. A distant sound broke the hush, a rhythm, slow and deliberate. Oh. At first she thought it was her mind giving her illusions to soften the end. But the sound grew closer, clear and real. A horse moved through the snow, steady as a heartbeat. Alma lifted her head weakly, strands of silver hair sticking to her cheeks. Through the blur of storm and tears, she saw the silhouette of a man on horseback. He wore a long, dark coat, snow gathering on the brim of his hat. His horse breathed heavy clouds into the night air. He dismounted without hurry, as if he had known all along she would be here. His boots sank into the snow with a quiet crunch. When he knelt beside her, he didn't look at her hair with superstition or disgust. He looked at her the way a man looks at something fragile and unexpected. "You'll freeze out here," he said softly. His voice was low, rough-edged but steady, like a river cutting through stone. Alma flinched when he reached for her. For so long, hands had meant rejection. But his movements were slow, careful, like someone touching a wounded bird. He wrapped his heavy coat around her, the scent of smoke and saddle leather clinging to the fabric. Warmth flooded her shoulders, sharp at first, then spreading through her like a mercy she didn't know she was allowed to feel. "You can let go," he said, as though reading the tension in her bones. She wanted to ask why. Why he was helping her. Why he didn't look away. But her lips were too cold to shape the words. He lifted her easily into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. As the storm howled, he carried her toward a distant shape, a cabin half buried in snow, smoke curling from its chimney like a stubborn prayer. Inside, fire cracked and popped in the stone hearth. The heat stung her skin at first, like sunlight after too long in darkness. He set her down gently near the fire, wrapping a wool blanket around her shoulders. The cabin smelled of cedar, ash, and quiet living. There were no pictures on the walls, no soft edges, only the practical stillness of a man who'd built solitude into a home. He poured hot water into a tin cup and placed it in her hands without asking questions. The steam fogged her lashes. She stared into the fire, unable to meet his eyes. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice cracked under the weight of it. "You're freezing," he said. "That's enough reason to be anywhere." Her fingers tightened around the cup. The world outside might have believed she was cursed, but in this small cabin, with fire crackling and a stranger's quiet presence filling the air, something loosened in her chest. Not hope. Not yet. Just the faint memory of what it might feel like to not be alone. She glanced at him. He stood a few feet away, leaning against the wooden beam near the door, hat still in his hand. He was broad-shouldered, with a face marked by weather and time. His name, she would later learn, was James Ashford, a man who had lost more than he'd ever spoken of. But in this moment she only saw his stillness, the calm that lived beneath the storm. "No one's ever stayed," she murmured. His gaze was steady. "Then maybe it's time someone does." Outside, the storm carried on like it had no end. In town, mouths would soon open. Words would fester in the corners of rooms, in the stale air of the saloon. The silver-haired girl had been taken in. They'd call it a mistake. They'd call her bad luck walking. But none of that noise touched the cabin walls tonight. Alma pressed the edge of the tin cup to her lips, heat bleeding into her frozen skin. She had learned not to trust moments like this. They vanished too easily. Yet something in his voice, the way he said nothing unnecessary, made her want to linger a little longer in this fragile warmth. Days passed with the kind of quiet that feels almost too fragile to breathe on. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer it. She watched him chop wood, ride into town, return without comment. She helped in small ways, folding blankets, tending the fire, mending a tear in the curtain near the door. They spoke little, but something wordless grew between them, soft as snow drifting onto old wood. The town, meanwhile, was restless. James had never brought anyone into his home before, and certainly not her. Men leaned over tables, voices sharp with suspicion. Women whispered at the well, eyes narrowing when they spoke her name. The weight of their judgment traveled through wind like smoke, but the cabin stood still, unbothered, lit by a single lantern. One night, the fire burned low, throwing shadows across the walls. Alma stood near the window, wrapped in his coat. The storm outside had softened into a steady fall of snow, quiet as a held breath. She stared at the darkness beyond the glass. Her reflection stared back, hair pale as moonlight, eyes dim with everything she'd carried alone. She touched a strand of her hair and whispered what she'd never dared to say aloud to anyone. "I'm not worth loving." The words hung between them. She hadn't realized he was behind her until she felt the warmth of his presence. He didn't step forward right away. He let the silence breathe, as if to tell her he had heard every wound behind those words. When he finally moved, it was with the same quiet surety he'd shown the night he found her in the snow. "You're mine now," he said. The words were not chains. They were shelter. A promise wrapped in rough edges. Not possession, but belonging. She didn't turn around at first. She closed her eyes and let the sound of his voice settle into her bones. The walls she had built around herself were thin things, brittle from too many winters alone. She turned slowly, her breath catching. His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, warm. For a heartbeat, the storm outside ceased to matter. So did the whispers. So did the years she'd spent believing she was a curse wearing a girl's body. "You could have left me," she whispered. "So could you," he said. A small, tremulous sound left her throat, half a laugh, half a sob. She didn't move forward, and he didn't pull her in. The space between them filled with something quieter than love, but just as powerful, the choice to stay. The firelight flickered against their faces, a warm glow against the cold world beyond the door. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the old window panes, but inside the cabin, there was stillness. It wasn't a grand moment. No thunder, no declarations. Just a man and a woman standing in the warm light of a fire, holding on to the fragile miracle of being seen. Long after she would come to call this place home, Alma would remember that night. She would remember the storm, the silver of her hair catching firelight, the whisper that reached her like a hand outstretched in the dark. They would build a life not of fairy tales but of quiet mornings and shared silence, of slow healing that no one else needed to understand. But for now, as the fire burned low and the storm raged on, Alma rose, once unwanted, once cast away, took her first breath of belonging. And in that breath, the story truly began.